every single day, without realizing it. You say yes to things you never consciously agreed to. You follow rules you never questioned. You obey voices you never chose to listen to. You comply with systems, structures, people, and pressures that have been carefully, deliberately, and psychologically engineered to produce exactly that response from you. And the most unsettling part is not that this happens. It is that it has been happening your entire life, and almost no one ever told you how. Human obedience is not a flaw in our nature. It is a feature. It is a deeply wired, evolutionarily ancient response system that allowed our ancestors to survive in groups, to coordinate action, to build civilizations, and to function inside hierarchies that made collective life possible. Without the capacity for compliance, there would be no society, no institutions, no families, no organizations of any kind. We are, at our biological core, creatures who are built to follow. But that same system, that magnificent, ancient, survival-tested architecture of compliance, can be understood, mapped, and used by leaders and manipulators alike, by healers and exploiters, by those who serve your genuine interests and those who serve only their own. The 14 laws in this book are the operating code of that system. They are the specific, documented, psychologically verified principles through which human beings are moved from resistance to agreement, from hesitation to action, from no to yes. Understanding them will change how you see every conversation, every request, every social interaction you have ever had. And that understanding begins with the most ancient law of all, the one that was operating before language, before culture, before civilization itself drew its first breath. Law 1. The law of authority. Before there were kings, there were alphas. Before there were governments, there were elders. Before there were institutions, there were individuals whose physical presence, social standing, or demonstrated competence caused others around them to defer. The human impulse to obey authority is not a cultural invention. It is a biological inheritance, and it runs so deep that it can be triggered not by genuine authority at all, but simply by the signals and symbols that authority has historically worn. This is the first and foundational law of human obedience, the law of authority. And it states, simply and with enormous consequence, that human beings are psychologically predisposed to comply with those they perceive as legitimate authorities, often without conscious evaluation of whether the authority is genuinely competent, genuinely trustworthy, or genuinely entitled to their compliance. The research on this is not ambiguous. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments that shook the foundations of what people believed about human moral autonomy. Ordinary participants, people with no particular history of cruelty or aggression, were instructed by a figure in a white lab coat to administer what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person, simply because someone in an authority costume told them to. The results were disturbing in their consistency. A substantial majority of participants complied with instructions to deliver what they believed were dangerous levels of shock, simply because the authority figure in the room continued to tell them to proceed. The participants were not monsters. They were ordinary human beings responding to a deeply wired authority compliance system, and the authority being responded to was not real in any meaningful sense. It was a costume, a title, a tone of voice, a setting that implied institutional legitimacy. The psychological trigger did not require genuine expertise or genuine entitlement. It required only the symbols that the brain has learned to associate with legitimate authority. Understanding this mechanism requires examining what, exactly, triggers the authority compliance response. Research and historical observation converge on a consistent set of signals. The first is title or credential. Doctors, professors, judges, generals, chief executives. These titles carry an automatic cognitive shortcut that says, this person has passed through a process of evaluation and certification. Their knowledge in this domain exceeds mine. Their judgment in this domain should supersede my own. The shortcut exists because most of the time, it is useful. The doctor really does know more about medicine than the patient. The judge really does have a trained understanding of law. But the shortcut can be hijacked when titles are fabricated, exaggerated, or applied outside their legitimate domain. The second trigger is physical appearance. Multiple studies have demonstrated that people perceived as physically imposing, well-dressed, or professionally groomed are more likely to be obeyed and believed than those who are not, even when their actual authority is identical. The tailored suit, the confident posture, the unhurried movement, the quality of eye contact. These physical signals have historically correlated with high-status individuals, and the brain uses them as proxies for authority even when they carry no actual informational content. The third trigger is what we might call environmental positioning. The person who sits at the head of the table, who occupies the largest chair, who stands at the front of the room, who enters last and exits first, who has their name on the building or the conference room. These positional signals communicate authority through spatial language that predates verbal communication. The brain reads the environment and extracts social hierarchy from it with extraordinary speed and very little conscious awareness. The fourth trigger is the voice of institutional backing. When an individual speaks for an organization, a government, a professional body, or any established institution, the weight of that institution augments their personal authority dramatically. This is why people who work for large, recognized organizations are given more immediate credence than independent individuals saying identical things. The institution is a kind of borrowed authority, and the brain extends its compliance response to anyone who appears to be its legitimate representative. Now, here is where this law becomes truly important for your daily life. The authority compliance response is, by design, fast. It operates below the level of conscious deliberation. By the time you are aware that you are deferring to someone, the neural processes that produce that deference have already completed. And this speed is what makes the law so exploitable. Because if you do not cultivate the habit of pausing, of asking the deliberate question, is this authority genuine and is it relevant to this particular situation, then you will comply by reflex rather than by choice. This is not just an abstract problem. It is a daily reality. The confidence with which a doctor recommends a medication, the title that appears on a consultant's proposal, the uniform that a security guard wears, the way a salesperson uses professional language and institutional backing to suggest that their recommendation carries the weight of expertise. In each of these cases, your authority compliance system is being engaged, and the question of whether it is being engaged appropriately depends entirely on whether you are paying attention. The law of authority also has a positive application that is worth understanding clearly. If you wish to be more effective in influencing others toward genuinely good outcomes, the strategic cultivation of legitimate authority signals is entirely ethical and frequently essential. This means investing in genuine credentials where they are relevant. It means developing the physical and environmental signals of confidence and competence. It means building associations with recognized institutions and respected figures in your domain. It means cultivating a presence that communicates, accurately and effectively, that your perspective on this particular subject deserves serious attention. The difference between manipulative use of authority signals and legitimate use is this. Manipulative use involves projecting authority in domains where it does not exist, or manufacturing the appearance of credentials that have not been earned. Legitimate use involves ensuring that the authority you have genuinely earned is visible and communicated in ways that make it useful to those who are trying to decide whether your perspective deserves their trust. The most important takeaway from the law of authority is not strategic, it is protective. The next time you feel the pull to comply simply because someone or something projects authority, pause for one deliberate moment and ask, is this authority genuine? Is it relevant here? And what would I think about this request if it came from someone with no title, no uniform, no institutional backing, just a regular person asking me to do the same thing? The gap between those two responses is the measure of how much the authority signal, rather than your own genuine judgment, is driving your decision. Law 2. The law of social proof. Look around you in any moment of genuine uncertainty, and you will find that your eyes do not look inward. They look outward, at what other people are doing, at how the crowd is moving, at what the majority seems to believe or accept or choose. This outward look is not weakness. It is an information-gathering strategy, and it is one of the most ancient and effective ones in the human behavioral repertoire. When you do not know what to do, find out what others like you are doing, and then do that. This is the law of social proof, and it operates with such pervasive consistency across so many domains of human behavior that once you understand it, you will begin to see its fingerprints on almost every significant choice you have ever made. The restaurants you chose because of the line outside, the books you read because everyone seemed to be reading them, the opinions you quietly revised when you discovered that most people around you held a different view. The risks you did not take because no one else in your environment seemed to be taking them. The psychology behind social proof is elegant in its logic. Human beings exist in social environments so complex and information-rich that it is genuinely impossible to independently evaluate every option we face. The cognitive load of doing so would be paralyzing. So we have evolved an efficient shortcut. Observe what others in situations similar to ours are doing, and use their behavior as a proxy for the right behavior. In environments where the collective wisdom of others is genuinely reliable, this shortcut works beautifully. In environments where that wisdom has been manufactured or distorted, it becomes a vulnerability. The first domain in which social proof operates powerfully is the domain of belief. What people around you believe affects what you believe, far more than most people are comfortable acknowledging. The process of belief formation is not primarily rational. It is primarily social. We absorb the beliefs of our communities, our families, our peer groups, and our media environments through a process of continuous, largely unconscious calibration. And the signal we are calibrating to is always, at some level, the same. What do people like me believe about this? This is why the most effective propaganda does not try to present compelling arguments. It creates the impression of consensus. It manufactures the sense that everyone, or at least everyone who matters, already holds a particular view. Once that impression is successfully installed, the social proof mechanism does the rest. People do not want to hold views that place them outside the consensus of their group. The psychological cost of perceived deviance from group belief is genuinely painful, and the path of least resistance is to adjust one's own beliefs toward whatever appears to be the norm. The second domain is the domain of behavior. The famous experiments on conformity conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s demonstrated that people will deny the evidence of their own senses rather than publicly disagree with a group consensus. Participants who could clearly see that one line was longer than another would nonetheless agree with the group's apparently incorrect assessment when everyone else in the room had been instructed to give the wrong answer. The pressure to maintain behavioral alignment with the group overrode the evidence of direct perception. This has extraordinary practical implications. The behaviors you engage in, the habits you maintain, the risks you take, and the standards you hold yourself to are all deeply influenced by what you observe as normal in your social environment. People who want to change their behavior and cannot understand why they keep reverting to old patterns are often missing this fundamental insight. Behavior change that is not supported by a change in social environment has to fight the constant headwind of social proof pushing back toward the old norm. The most powerful single thing you can do to change your behavior is to change the social environment in which you observe normal behavior. The third domain, and the one most directly relevant to compliance, is the domain of decision. When we are uncertain about whether to say yes to something, whether to buy, to join, to follow, to believe, we look for evidence that others like us have already said yes. This is why testimonials work. This is why popularity metrics are displayed so prominently in digital environments. This is why sales figures and subscriber counts and crowd sizes are always mentioned when someone is trying to convince you of something. Each of these pieces of information is a social proof signal, and each one shifts the compliance calculus in the direction of yes. The sophisticated manipulation of social proof involves creating the impression of consensus where none actually exists. Fake reviews, manufactured crowds, orchestrated social media agreement. Astroturfing, which is the creation of the appearance of grassroots support for a position that is in fact the product of a coordinated campaign. Each of these is a deliberate exploitation of the social proof mechanism, and each works with disturbing effectiveness precisely because the mechanism was designed to be efficient rather than critical. It registers the signal of consensus and activates the compliance response before the conscious mind has had time to evaluate whether the consensus is genuine. The protective insight here is one of the most broadly useful you will take from this book. Always ask who benefits from the appearance of consensus that you are being shown. Not every display of social proof is manufactured, but the question of who is showing it to you, and for what purpose, is always worth asking. Because real consensus that is in your genuine interest does not usually need to be sold to you. The situations in which the social proof signal is being most aggressively deployed are frequently the situations in which you most need to pause and think independently. Law 3. The law of reciprocity. Deep in the architecture of human social life, there is an economy so ancient and so pervasive that most people never even notice they are participating in it. It is not a formal economy. It has no currency, no exchange rate, no written rules. And yet it governs an extraordinary proportion of human behavior. It is the economy of obligation, the felt imperative to return what has been given, the psychological discomfort of receiving without giving back, the social and moral pressure that accumulates when one person has done something for another, and that something has not yet been matched. This is the law of reciprocity, and it is one of the most reliably powerful forces in the entire psychology of compliance. Give someone something, whether it is a gift, a favor, information, time, attention, or any other form of value, and you have not just given them a thing. You have placed them, whether they want to be there or not, inside a psychological state of obligation. A state that will, in the majority of cases, and in the majority of people, produce a felt need to give back. And that need can be directed, by the person who created it, toward almost any form of return they choose to request. The research on this principle is both extensive and striking. In one well-known set of studies, a researcher sent Christmas cards to strangers, people he had never met. Despite having no prior relationship with these people, he received a substantial number of cards back. The recipients felt the obligation to reciprocate even with a complete stranger, simply because something had been given. In restaurant settings, studies have shown that leaving a small gift, a mint, a piece of candy, along with the bill produces a measurable increase in the tip left. The gift was trivial in monetary value, but it activated the reciprocity mechanism, and that mechanism produced a disproportionate return. The disproportionate nature of reciprocity returns is one of the most important things to understand about this law. The gift that initiates the reciprocity cycle does not need to be large to create a large obligation. In fact, gifts that are given with apparent warmth and genuine care, that seem personal rather than transactional, can create obligations that vastly exceed the material value of the original gift. A small, thoughtful gesture that feels genuinely considerate can create more felt obligation than a large, impersonal transaction. Because reciprocity is not, at its root, an economic calculation. It is an emotional and social one. The first mechanism through which this law is deliberately exploited is what we might call the mechanism of the uninvited gift. Because the reciprocity mechanism is activated by receiving, not by requesting, a gift that arrives without being asked for still creates the obligation. The unsolicited sample. The unexpected favor. The gift that comes before any transaction is proposed. Each of these creates a psychological state of obligation that the giver can then leverage when the time comes to make a request. The person who has received something, even something they did not ask for and did not particularly want, feels less free to say no to the giver than they would have felt before the gift arrived. This is why organizations that want your compliance frequently begin by giving you something. Free information. A complimentary consultation, a sample product, an unsolicited gesture of service or support. Each of these gifts is genuinely freely given in the sense that you are not required to do anything in return, but they are not freely given in the psychological sense because they have activated the reciprocity mechanism, and the psychological cost of then saying no to whatever comes next is meaningfully higher than it was before. The second mechanism is what we might call the mechanism of the concession. One of the most powerful applications of reciprocity in negotiation is the strategic concession. When one party makes a visible concession to the other, backing down from a position, offering something additional, agreeing to a term they had previously resisted, the receiving party feels reciprocal pressure to make a concession in return. This is the principle behind the classic negotiating tactic of starting with an extreme position and then visibly moving toward the center. Each move toward the center is experienced by the other party as a concession, and it activates the reciprocity mechanism, creating pressure to match the movement. The protective response to the law of reciprocity is not ingratitude. It is not the refusal to accept gifts or to acknowledge generosity. It is the simple, deliberate act of separating the experience of receiving from the question of what you will give in return. When someone gives you something, you can genuinely appreciate the gift and genuinely feel warmth toward the giver without allowing those feelings to override your independent assessment of whether their subsequent request is actually something you want to agree to. The gift and the request are two separate things, and your response to the request should be governed by your assessment of the request, not by the feeling of obligation created by the gift. This is easier said than done, because the reciprocity mechanism operates below the level of deliberate thought. But the awareness of it, the simple knowledge that you are in a reciprocity-activated state, is a significant step toward reclaiming your freedom to choose. Ask yourself, the next time you feel the pull of obligation in a situation where someone has recently been generous with you, would I say yes to this request if I had not just received something from this person? If the answer is no, then you are being moved by reciprocity rather than by genuine agreement. And genuine agreement is what all meaningful compliance should rest on. Law 4. The law of commitment and consistency. Once a human being has taken a position, made a choice, expressed a belief, or taken an action, a powerful psychological force activates within them, the desire to be, and to appear to be, consistent with that prior commitment. This is not stubbornness. It is not simple ego. It is a deeply wired and in many ways deeply useful drive that allows us to maintain stable identities, to be reliable in the eyes of others, and to make decisions that build on prior learning rather than starting from zero every time. But this drive, like every other psychological mechanism in this book, can be understood and exploited. And the law of commitment and consistency is one of the most powerful tools in the compliance arsenal precisely because the behavior it produces does not require ongoing pressure. Once the initial commitment has been extracted, the target applies the pressure themselves. The desire for consistency is internal, and it does its work long after the person who triggered it has left the room. The classic experimental demonstration of this principle is known as the foot-in-the-door technique. In the original study, researchers asked homeowners to place a large, ugly sign in their front garden reading, "Drive carefully." Most homeowners refused. But among those who had, 2 weeks earlier, agreed to a much smaller request, to place a small sign in their window, the majority agreed to the large, ugly sign as well. The prior small commitment had changed how they saw themselves. They now identified, to some small degree, as people who support road safety causes. And when the larger request arrived, consistency with that self-image made compliance far more likely. This finding has been replicated in dozens of contexts and extended in important ways. The key insight is that commitments are most binding when they are active, public, and effortful. An action taken voluntarily and visibly, that costs something in terms of time or energy or social exposure, creates a stronger sense of self-definitional commitment than a passive or anonymous or costless action. When you have done something publicly, the world now knows something about you, and the desire to be consistent with what the world knows about you is extraordinarily powerful. The foot-in-the-door technique is everywhere once you learn to see it. Every small yes you give to an organization, a salesperson, a cause, or a person increases the likelihood that you will give a larger yes later, because each small yes has quietly updated your self-image in the direction of someone who agrees with, supports, or identifies with whatever the request was about. The request to sign a petition, the minor donation, the agreement to attend a single meeting, the small public endorsement. Each of these is a foot in your door, and each one makes the next larger request slightly easier to say yes to. The escalation of commitment is the mechanism through which this law becomes most consequential in personal and professional life. Once we have invested in something, whether an organization, a relationship, a belief system, or a course of action, the commitment tends to grow rather than diminish with time. We interpret new information through the lens of our existing commitment. We discount evidence that suggests we were wrong. We magnify evidence that suggests we were right. And we take increasingly large actions to demonstrate, to ourselves and to others, the validity and depth of our commitment. This is the psychology behind a remarkable range of human behavior that otherwise seems irrational. The investor who continues pouring money into a failing venture because they have been publicly associated with its success. The person who remains in a damaging relationship long after the evidence suggests they should leave, because leaving would mean admitting that the years they invested were misplaced. The team member who continues defending a strategy they privately doubt because they championed it publicly in a meeting 6 months ago. In each of these cases, the person is not being simply irrational. They are responding to the psychological imperative of consistency, the felt need to maintain alignment between who they have publicly appeared to be and who they are continuing to act as. And this imperative is so powerful that it can override very clear evidence, very significant costs, and very genuine doubts. The protective response to the law of commitment and consistency requires what we might call principled inconsistency, the willingness to acknowledge, without shame, that new information or new understanding has changed your position. The person who can say, "I believed this before, and I believe something different now, and here is why," is exercising a form of intellectual and moral courage that is genuinely rare. Because the social cost of visible inconsistency is real. People value predictability in others, And the person who changes their mind visibly is sometimes criticized for it. But the alternative, remaining committed to positions and actions that you know are wrong because the cost of inconsistency is uncomfortable, is far more expensive in the long run. The willingness to be wrong, to change, to update, to say, I was mistaken, and this is what I think now, is not a weakness in the psychology of power. It is one of the most sophisticated and ultimately most influential things a person can do. Because the person who is willing to revise their position in the face of evidence communicates something that is genuinely rare and genuinely powerful, that their assessments can be trusted, that when they hold a position, it is because they have examined it, not simply because they held it yesterday. Law 5, the law of liking. Of all the laws in this book, the law of liking may be the most obvious and the most systematically underestimated. It is obvious because everyone knows it on some level. We are more likely to comply with requests from people we like. We are more easily influenced by people we find attractive, charming, warm, funny, familiar, or similar to ourselves. This is not a controversial insight. It is basic human experience, and yet most people, even knowing this, fail to understand the depth and breadth of its operation. Because the law of liking is not just about being pleasant or popular. It is about a systematic bias in our compliance systems that causes us to extend trust, credulity, generosity, and obedience to people we like in ways that we would never extend them to equally or more qualified strangers. The components of liking that most reliably produce compliance are well documented. The first is physical attractiveness. Multiple decades of research have established that physically attractive people are judged more favorably across almost every domain. They are assumed to be more intelligent, more competent, more trustworthy, and more deserving of good outcomes. They receive more lenient treatment in legal contexts, more favorable evaluations in professional contexts, and more compliance in social contexts. This is the halo effect applied to appearance, and it operates almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness. The second component is similarity. We are drawn to those who remind us of ourselves, who share our background, our values, our tastes, our sense of humor, our life experiences. The experience of finding someone similar to yourself is the experience of finding confirmation, of meeting someone whose existence validates something about your own. And this validation creates warmth, and warmth creates willingness to help, to agree, to give the benefit of the doubt. This is why skilled influence practitioners invest heavily in the early stages of a relationship in finding and emphasizing points of genuine commonality. Not fabricating them, because fabricated similarity is easily detected and destroys trust, but finding and making visible the genuine points of shared experience, perspective, and identity. The third component is familiarity. The mere exposure effect, documented extensively in psychological research, shows that repeated exposure to something, even without any particular positive interaction, tends to increase liking for it. The face you have seen before feels safer than the completely unfamiliar face. The brand whose name you have encountered multiple times feels more trustworthy than the brand you are seeing for the first time. The person who has appeared in your world repeatedly, even in contexts where you have not interacted directly, carries a felt familiarity that operates as a low-level liking signal. The fourth component is association. We like people who are associated with things we like, and we unconsciously extend our positive feelings about those things to the people connected with them. This is why advertising relentlessly associates products with attractive people, beautiful landscapes, and positive emotional experiences. The positive feelings generated by the imagery attach to the product, and the product is then evaluated through the lens of those feelings. The same mechanism operates in social contexts. The person who is introduced to you by someone you trust and like begins their relationship with you already carrying some of the positive affect you have for the introducer. The fifth component is warmth and genuine care. Perhaps the most powerful component of liking, and the one that is least easily manufactured, is the experience of feeling that another person genuinely cares about you, about your well-being, your interests, your experience. When someone communicates this care authentically, through attention, through remembering what matters to you, through acts of consideration that cost them something, they create a bond that is far more durable and far more powerful than any of the other components of liking could generate alone. This is the liking that becomes loyalty. And loyalty is the deepest form of compliance there is. The protective awareness here is not about becoming cold or suspicious toward people you like. The problem is not that you are influenced by liking. The problem arises when you allow the presence of liking to override an independent assessment of whether a particular request or influence attempt is genuinely in your interest. The next time you are about to agree to something, pause and ask, would I agree to this if the request were coming from someone I did not particularly like? If the answer is no, then the liking is doing work that your own genuine judgment should be doing. Law 6. The law of scarcity. Value is not determined by utility alone. It is powerfully shaped by availability. The same object, offer, opportunity, or experience carries a fundamentally different psychological weight when it is abundant than when it is rare. And this difference in psychological weight translates, with remarkable consistency, into a difference in behavior. We want what is scarce. We work harder, pay more, and comply more readily for access to things that we believe are genuinely limited in availability or time. This is the law of scarcity, and it operates through a mechanism that is so fundamental to human motivation that it applies across virtually every domain of life, from consumer behavior to romantic attraction to political allegiance to the assessment of ideas themselves. The psychological root of the scarcity effect lies in what researchers call reactance theory, when our freedom to obtain something is threatened, whether by limited supply, by a competing demand, or by a time constraint. We experience a psychological state of reactance, a motivational response oriented toward restoring the threatened freedom, and the action most likely to restore that freedom is to obtain the scarce thing before the window closes. This response is not irrational in environments where scarcity is genuine. If there really are only a limited number of something you need, and if others really are competing for it, then acting quickly is the correct response. The problem arises when the scarcity is manufactured, when the deadline is artificial, when the limited quantity has been deliberately set far below the actual supply, when the impression of competition has been created rather than observed. In these cases, the reactance mechanism is being triggered by false information, and the behavior it produces serves the interest of the person who created the false scarcity rather than the interest of the person responding to it. The mechanisms through which scarcity is manufactured are widely known but insufficiently recognized in real time. The countdown timer on the e-commerce website, the only 3 seats left notification on the booking platform, the limited edition product that turns out to be continuously reprinted, the once-in-a-lifetime offer that reappears every month, the exclusive membership that somehow always has one spot available at the moment of maximum interest. Each of these is a deliberately constructed scarcity signal, and each activates the reactance response in ways that can override careful evaluation of whether the offer is actually good. The temporal dimension of scarcity is particularly powerful. Time-limited offers exploit a specific feature of human psychology, the asymmetric pain of loss versus gain. Research has consistently shown that the pain of losing something or missing out on something is approximately twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. This means that the threat of losing access to an opportunity, even one you did not previously want or seek, is far more motivating than the prospect of simply gaining access to the same opportunity. The feeling of potential loss, of the window closing, of missing out, creates a psychological urgency that can short-circuit deliberate evaluation entirely. This is the psychology behind what has come to be known informally in recent years as the fear of missing out. The anxiety of watching others access experiences, relationships, or opportunities that you are not accessing. This anxiety, in its manufactured form, is one of the most effectively deployed psychological weapons in the modern attention economy. Social media platforms are extraordinarily skilled at manufacturing the impression of a constantly moving social experience from which you are perpetually at risk of being left behind, because that manufactured scarcity keeps you continuously engaged and continuously compliant with the behavioral demands of the platform. The protective response to the law of scarcity requires the cultivation of what might be called intentional pause. When you feel the urgency of scarcity, the sense that you must decide now or lose the opportunity, that feeling is itself information. It is telling you that your reactance mechanism has been activated. And the appropriate response to that information is not to act faster, but to slow down. To ask, if this opportunity is as good as I am being made to feel it is, why is the pressure to decide immediately so great? Genuine opportunities rarely require immediate decisions. The urgency of a genuine opportunity speaks for itself. The urgency of a manufactured one requires engineering. Law 7. The law of fear and threat. We have spoken about fear in the context of power and control in earlier sections of this audiobook. But the role of fear in compliance is distinct enough and specific enough to deserve its own treatment as a law. Because fear is not merely one tool among many in the compliance arsenal. It is, historically and practically, the most ancient and most reliable mechanism for producing obedience. And understanding how it works and how it is weaponized is essential to anyone who wants to understand why people do what they do. Fear produces compliance through a mechanism that is both simple and profound. When a threat is perceived, whether the threat is physical, social, financial, or reputational, the brain's threat response system activates and reorganizes the priorities of the whole organism around the single question of how to eliminate or avoid the threat. In this state, the nuanced, deliberate, value-driven decision-making that we associate with genuine autonomous choice is dramatically diminished. The question is no longer, what do I actually want to do here? The question is, how do I make this threat go away? And if the person who created the threat is also the person who can remove it, then the path of least resistance is compliance with whatever they require. Not because the compliance is genuinely chosen, but because the threat has narrowed the perceived option space until compliance appears to be the only viable path. This dynamic is at work in every coercive relationship and every oppressive system. The employer who communicates, always implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that employment is contingent on behaviors that would otherwise be unacceptable. The intimate partner who uses the threat of emotional withdrawal, public humiliation, or physical harm to control the other person's behavior. The government that maintains compliance through the threat of legal, financial, or physical consequences for those who deviate from approved behavior. The social group that uses the threat of exclusion and reputational damage to enforce conformity to its norms. In each of these cases, the compliance produced is real, but it is not chosen. And compliance that is not chosen is not genuine agreement. It is the behavioral outcome of threat management. And it carries with it a profound hidden cost. The resentment, the damage to intrinsic motivation, and the degradation of the relationship between the compliant party and whatever or whoever they are complying with. Research on motivation has consistently shown that fear-driven compliance produces a specific and predictable behavioral pattern. People do exactly what is required to avoid the threatened consequence, and nothing more. They comply minimally. They do not innovate. They do not invest their best thinking. They do not go beyond the letter of the requirement because they have no intrinsic motivation to do so. They are, in effect, occupied territory rather than willing participants. An occupied territory requires constant policing, because the moment the threat is removed, the behavior it was producing will change. This is the fundamental strategic weakness of fear-based compliance. It is expensive to maintain and deeply fragile. It produces the appearance of loyalty without the reality. It generates minimum viable behavior rather than discretionary effort. And it accumulates over time, a reservoir of resentment that will express itself in ways that are difficult to predict and difficult to manage when the opportunity finally arises. The person who wants to understand the law of fear, not in order to wield it, but in order to recognize it, needs to develop a sensitivity to a specific internal signal. The feeling that you cannot say no. Not that you do not want to say no. Not that you have considered the options and decided that yes is genuinely the best choice, but that no does not feel genuinely available as an option. That the cost of no has been implicitly or explicitly defined in terms that make it feel prohibitive. That your compliance is being secured not through genuine appeal to your values and interests, but through the management of your threat perception. That feeling, when it is present, is almost always a sign that the law of fear is in operation. And the most powerful single response to it is to clearly and deliberately identify the actual consequences of non-compliance. Not the threatened consequences, which are usually designed to appear larger and more certain than they actually are. The actual, realistic, objectively assessed consequences. Because fear, like almost every influence mechanism, derives much of its power from exaggeration, and daylight is its greatest enemy. Law 8. The law of identity and belonging. No human being exists as an isolated individual. We are, from birth to death, defined by our memberships, our families, our communities, our professions, our cultures, our ideologies. These are not simply contexts we inhabit. They are, In a profound psychological sense, who we are. They form the substrate of identity, and the compliance that flows from identity is among the deepest and most durable in the entire spectrum of human obedience. This is the law of identity and belonging. It states that human beings will comply with the norms, demands, and expectations of any group with which they strongly identify, even when that compliance conflicts with their independent interests, their personal values, as they would articulate them in isolation, and sometimes even their basic well-being. Because the alternative, the violation of group identity, the experience of exclusion and the loss of belonging, is experienced as a threat to the self that is often more painful than any of the consequences that compliance might bring. The first mechanism of this law is what we might call the mechanism of categorical identity. We do not just belong to groups. We become the groups we belong to. The identity of doctor, parent, patriot, believer, activist, entrepreneur. Each of these is not simply a role we play, but a lens through which we see ourselves and a framework through which we interpret our obligations. And once an identity is internalized, the behaviors associated with it become felt as intrinsic rather than external. The doctor does not help patients because they have been told to. They help patients because helping patients is what doctors do, and they are a doctor. The compliance is built into the identity. This is why the most effective compliance systems do not begin by telling people what to do. They begin by telling people who they are. By offering an identity that people find meaningful and appealing, they create a framework of self-conception within which the desired behaviors appear not as demands, but as natural expressions of identity. The religious organization that offers membership in a community of the chosen. The political movement that offers the identity of freedom fighter or defender of values. The company culture that offers the identity of innovator or changemaker. Each of these is a compliance system built not on rules, but on identity, and it is extraordinarily effective because its policing is internal rather than external. The second mechanism is the mechanism of social pain. The brain processes the pain of social exclusion through some of the same neural pathways that process physical pain. Being rejected, ostracized, shamed, or excluded from a group you identify with is not merely uncomfortable. It is, in a neurological sense, genuinely painful. And this means that the threat of exclusion, of being cast out of the identity group, is a compliance mechanism that operates through the same basic psychology as physical threat. This is why cult-like organizations, whether religious, political, or commercial, invest so heavily in creating conditions that make exit feel like psychic death. The social ties within the group are deliberately intensified. The sense of specialness and of having access to exclusive truth is cultivated. The outside world is framed as dangerous, inferior, or lost. And the consequence of non-compliance is always, ultimately, the threat of exclusion from the only world that feels real and safe and meaningful to the member. The protective response to the law of identity and belonging is not the abandonment of identity or the rejection of belonging. These are genuine human needs, and the person who tries to live without them pays a real psychological price. The protective response is the cultivation of multiple diverse sources of identity and belonging. Because the person whose entire identity is invested in a single group is maximally vulnerable to compliance pressure from that group. The person whose sense of self is grounded in multiple memberships, multiple communities, multiple sources of meaning and recognition, has far more psychological freedom. The cost of non-compliance with any single group's demands is lower because their sense of who they are does not depend entirely on maintaining that group's approval. Law 9. The law of framing. Reality is always interpreted, never simply received. And the frame through which we receive it, the conceptual and linguistic structure that shapes how a situation is defined, what it is compared to, what it is called, and what options it appears to contain, determines in large measure what we feel about it and what we do in response. This is the law of framing, and it may be the most intellectually interesting of all 14 laws, because it operates entirely at the level of meaning rather than fact, shaping not what we know but how what we know feels. Consider a simple example. A medical procedure that has a 90% survival rate and a medical procedure that has a 10% mortality rate are factually identical. But research has consistently shown that people make different decisions about whether to undergo the procedure depending on which framing they receive. The survival frame feels safer, more positive, more hopeful. The mortality frame activates loss aversion, fear, and caution. The facts are the same. The frame changes everything. This is the essential insight of the law of framing. The same content, presented within different frames, produces different emotional responses, different evaluations, and different compliance behaviors. And the person who controls the frame controls, to a significant degree, the direction of the choice. The first dimension of framing is language. The words used to describe a situation carry connotations that shape its emotional meaning independently of their literal content. Calling a military action a campaign of liberation or a campaign of occupation, calling a tax an investment in public services or a government taking of private earnings, calling a business practice aggressive or entrepreneurial. In each of these cases, the choice of language is itself a framing choice, one that activates different emotional associations, different reference points, and different evaluative frameworks. The second dimension is comparison. What a thing is compared to shapes how it is valued. An offer that seems mediocre in isolation can appear generous when contrasted with something significantly worse. A price that seems high in isolation seems reasonable when presented after a significantly higher price. A sacrifice that seems large in the abstract seems small when framed against a larger sacrifice that someone else has made. Every framing choice creates a comparison, and every comparison affects the evaluation of the thing being compared. The third dimension is what might be called the option architecture, how choices are presented, the order they appear in, the defaults that are set, the number of options available, and the way they are labeled. All of these structural features of a decision environment are framing elements that profoundly affect what gets chosen. Research on what is now called behavioral economics and choice architecture has demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that the way options are arranged changes which option is selected, independent of the content of the options themselves. The protective response to the law of framing is the habit of deliberate reframing. When you receive information, especially information that is being used to move you toward a decision, ask yourself, what other frame could this same information be placed in? What comparison is being implicitly made? And is it the most accurate or useful comparison? What language is being used, and what emotional work is that language doing? What options are being presented as available, and are those actually all of the options? This questioning does not require cynicism. It requires only the recognition that every presentation of information is also a framing of information, and that the frame was chosen by someone for a reason. Law 10. The law of emotional state. Decisions are not made by minds. They are made by states. The emotional state you are in at the moment of a compliance request is one of the most powerful determinants of whether you will say yes. And this is a fact that every sophisticated influence practitioner understands and uses. The law of emotional state recognizes that the human decision-making process is not a clean, context-independent rational calculation. It is a process that is profoundly contaminated, in both positive and negative senses, by the emotional environment in which it occurs. The same request, made to the same person, can receive very different responses depending on whether that person is in a state of happiness, anxiety, guilt, excitement, fear, gratitude, or irritation. And the person who creates the emotional state before making the request is exercising one of the most powerful forms of influence available. The first mechanism is the mechanism of positive affect. When people are in good moods, they are more generous, more trusting, more creative in finding reasons to say yes, and more willing to overlook potential downsides of a request. This is not a trivial effect. Studies have shown that the same request made to someone who has just experienced something pleasant, even something as minor as finding a small amount of money or eating a piece of chocolate, receives a significantly higher compliance rate than the identical request made in a neutral emotional environment. This is why skilled salespeople, skilled diplomats, skilled leaders, and skilled seducers of all kinds invest so heavily in creating pleasant emotional environments before making their requests. The nice meal, the comfortable setting, the warm tone, the gentle humor, the attentive listening. Each of these is not mere courtesy. It is emotional state management in preparation for a compliance request. The second mechanism is the mechanism of guilt. Guilt is a particularly powerful compliance generator because it produces a felt need for remediation. When you feel guilty, you are motivated to do something that will relieve that guilt. And the most available form of relief is often compliance with whatever request appears to offer it. This is why skilled manipulators often invest in creating guilt before making their requests, by highlighting what they have sacrificed for you, by pointing to unmet obligations, by framing their request as a chance to make right something that has been made wrong. The third mechanism is the mechanism of anxiety management. When people are anxious, they are particularly vulnerable to compliance requests that promise to reduce or manage their anxiety. The offer that promises security, certainty, clarity, or protection activates strong compliance motivation in an anxious person, because anxiety is the experience of threat without a clear response. Any offer that appears to provide a clear response to a felt threat will be evaluated with significantly less critical scrutiny than it would receive in a calmer emotional state. The protective response to the law of emotional state is the practice of what we might call state awareness. Before making any significant decision, pause long enough to honestly assess the emotional state you are currently in, and whether that state is clouding your evaluation. Are you making this decision from a calm, clear position, or are you making it from guilt, from anxiety, from the warmth of recent generosity, from the euphoria of excitement? None of these states necessarily leads to wrong decisions. But the decision you make while emotionally activated is a decision you should revisit when the activation has passed, because the decision that looks right from both states is the one you can trust. Law 11. The law of gradual escalation. The path from a small yes to a large yes is paved with medium yeses. This is the essence of the law of gradual escalation, the systematic practice of moving a target through a series of incrementally increasing compliance requests, each of which is small enough to seem reasonable given what has already been conceded, and all of which together produce a level of compliance that would never have been agreed to in a single step. We have touched on elements of this law in the discussions of commitment and consistency and incremental normalization. But the law of gradual escalation deserves its own dedicated treatment because it is distinct in its mechanism and its scope. Where the law of commitment and consistency focuses on the identity changes produced by commitment, the law of gradual escalation focuses on the behavioral pathway itself, the step-by-step architecture through which even deeply unwilling compliance can eventually be produced. The mechanism is straightforward. Every yes changes the landscape. Once you have agreed to something, the next request arrives in a context that already contains your prior agreement, and the prior agreement serves as a new baseline. The escalated request does not ask you to jump from 0 to 10. It asks you to move from 7 to 8, and from 8 to 9, and from 9 to 10. And each of those individual steps is small enough to seem almost identical to what you have already done. This mechanism operates in abusive relationships with textbook clarity. The first instance of controlling behavior is isolated and relatively mild. It is followed by warmth and apparent remorse. The second instance is slightly more significant. It too is followed by warmth. Over time, the baseline of what is normal in the relationship has shifted so dramatically that behaviors which would have been immediately and firmly rejected at the beginning of the relationship are accepted, rationalized, and accommodated. Not because the person has become weaker, but because each individual step was small enough to seem manageable, and the accumulated distance from the starting point has never been fully reckoned with. The protective response is the practice of absolute position rather than relative comparison. Do not evaluate a request relative to the last request that was made. Evaluate it relative to an absolute standard. Is this something I genuinely want to agree to, independent of what I have agreed to recently? The step from 7 to 8 may seem small. But if 8 was never where you wanted to end up, the smallness of the step is irrelevant. Law 12. The law of environmental design. The choices people make are not made in a vacuum. They are made in environments. Physical spaces, digital interfaces, organizational structures, social settings. All of these are environments, and all of them have been, to varying degrees, designed. And the design of an environment is one of the most powerful and least recognized influences on the behavior of the people inside it. The law of environmental design states that the physical and structural features of the environment in which a compliance request is made, or in which a decision is taken, influence the likelihood and nature of compliance in ways that operate almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness. The examples of this law at work are everywhere, once you learn to look for them. The supermarket that places the most profitable items at eye level and the staple necessities at the far back. The casino that removes windows and clocks to eliminate any external time reference. The office that places the coffee machine at a central location to create informal encounters that build social cohesion. The checkout page design that pre-selects the more expensive subscription tier. The hospital cafeteria that places healthy food options at the front of the serving line and less healthy options at the back. In each of these cases, Behavior is being shaped by the design of the environment without any direct request or instruction to the people inside it. They are simply choosing, apparently freely, from the options presented to them. But the presentation of those options has been deliberately engineered to make certain choices more likely than others. This is what behavioral economists and choice architects call a nudge, and it is a form of compliance engineering so subtle that most people never recognize it as such. The protective response to the law of environmental design is the cultivation of environmental awareness. Ask whenever you find yourself in a designed space or a structured choice situation, who designed this environment and what behavior were they hoping to produce? This question alone will reveal the enormous amount of behavioral influence that is quietly being exercised on you in the course of an ordinary day. And that recognition, combined with a deliberate choice to override the design in the moments that matter, is one of the most practically useful applications of everything in this book. Law 13. The Law of Narrative and Story. Human beings are not primarily rational animals. We are primarily storytelling animals. We make sense of our experience through narrative. We understand the world not as a collection of facts, but as a collection of stories. And we are moved, in ways that data and logic rarely achieve, by stories that resonate with our emotional lives and our deepest sense of what matters. This is the law of narrative and story, and it may be the most underestimated law in this entire collection. Because the story, properly told, does not feel like influence. It feels like experience.